Okay. So that was great to be led through that information, some of which was new to me, others I'm familiar with, because a lot of this type of research is what inspires the art and activism that I'm doing. And I just put up art inquiry action because those are the kind of what I'm doing, I guess, right? It's research-based art. It is often collaborative. It's interdisciplinary, and it's kind of goal-oriented. And I was going to start with this Project Accidentes, which is from 2011. It was commissioned by Matadero, which is in Madrid. And it's kind of an interesting call. It was, the premise was to bring in international artists. So my collaborator, Ricardo Miranda, and I were asked to collaborate with two local artists in Madrid, Jose Bangore and Beatriz Marcos. And it was kind of like Match.com. We didn't know these artists. The curators were like, you all kind of have a similar groove going on. We think you'll relate to each other and make an interesting mix. So we did Skype sessions for 6 months before we landed in Madrid, and it was an open, this huge, Matadero is an old butcher shop, believe it or not, and this like long nave-like space. Each bay had different team of artist collaborators, and it was focused on social practice, activism, work in progress, and was really supposed to be like an open studio kind of environment. And so in the beginning of our conversation, we said, we're coming to your city, tell us what we should be working on. And they said food rescue. They were really, this was 2000, I said 2011, it might have been 2010, but there was an economic downturn. They were seeing people of all types, all ages, races, kind of, from all different walks of life, taking food out of the garbage and eating it. And we were like, oh, you mean people are dumpster diving in Madrid? And they were like, well, there's not that kind of culture where it's this positive kind of anarchist way of like reusing and disturbing the systems of the city. It's deeply humiliating for the Spanish people. So really what we set out to do is to look at this phenomenon and try to create new systems and flows for the food and to connect edible food with people who were hungry. And so we took these structures, they're used often for holding tanks for chemicals and different commercial liquids. We took the interior out, which is plastic, used that grid-like steel on the outside to make a cart. And the cart transforms into a display unit. We worked with this traditional mercado, and which were kind of going extinct in place of the supermarkets, more American style, so there's that conversation too. And we asked the merchants to set aside their edible food at the end of the day, and we would come by with a cart and pick it up and then wheel it across the city into public places and display the food with shopping bags and some sort of, encouraging banner to take what you need. So the interesting thing about this, from my perspective and Ricardo's perspective, we were both used to doing interventionist kind of work within the communities, and both Jose and Beatriz were really adamant that we don't involve ourselves, that we put the card there and we step away. And so there weren't really interactions and conversations, which is something I think I would have naturally done as part of my practice, and just kind of step back and see what happened. And so this is another public space where we left the cart. And at the end of our 6 months residency within Matadero, what was really obvious to us was that if we wanted this to be more than just a prototype or some sort of like a provocation, that we needed to deal with the legal system, because while the merchants were fine with setting aside the food as part of this art exhibition. We had this institution, which was prestigious, and it kind of allayed fears that long term this wouldn't be possible because they were afraid if someone got sick, they would be sued, and there was no kind of security. They felt that they would be liable. So this was actually after Ricardo and I left Madrid. Jose and Beatrice continued, brought in legal scholars and law students and local politicians to say, what would this look like if we drafted a policy to make it so that a system like this could continue and protect the merchants and allow this to happen. When we got back to New York City, the curators, there was extra money from our commission, and they were like, go home and devise what Accidentes would look like in New York City. What would this project look like where you're from? So Ricardo and I did a lot of research. That's the farmers market at the head of Prospect Park, Grand Army Plaza. City Harvest, as many of you probably know, is a huge organization that does food rescue and quite successfully and is really amazing. So we're seeing that food rescue, that those cracks were kind of, not totally, but they were being addressed by very respectable organizations. There's also Food Not Bombs and other groups more informally dealing with food rescue. And there's also, I'm going to forget the name, a Good Samaritan Act under Clinton, which did exactly what they were looking at in Madrid in terms of if organizations, if markets donate food that is destined for the garbage but still edible, they are not liable. So that's not a concern in the United States, which is pretty amazing. We also did research like we took trash from bodegas and small markets, and we brought it back to our home and opened it up, kind of similar to what you guys are talking about, except this was more like, opening up a present, not knowing really what's going to be inside. And we wanted to see, we had seen statistics about how much organics were in these garbage bags, and we found that this was true, that there is about 30 to 50% of these bags from the bodegas, and this wasn't residential, these were commercial, were full of food. So these are kind of some research shots. We talked to a lot of experts and people involved in food industry, making films about food waste. And then we did this informal survey where we went and talked to a bunch of small markets and bodegas and asked questions about, what happens to the food you don't sell, and a lot of it's sent back to distributors. But the part that really got us is that most of these organizations, most of these businesses, threw food away, and there was very little composting. This one. And different places we found there are different dumpster diving hotspots, like Trader Joe's is really popular, and some of the gourmet bodegas, they seem kind of proud of it, like, yes, we're a dumpster diving hotspot. And so it's all understood, and there's these, unspoken rules, and this was a pretty fun survey to, not comprehensive, but it kind of gave us more insight into what was happening at the small business commercial level. I'm going backwards. I got upside down.
That's my local grocery store too.
It is?
The Bat on Vanderbilt?
Oh yeah. We're neighbors then.
Yes.
Yeah. So then we were mapping out, where is all this food going from the farms to the markets, from the garbage to dumpster divers. There are all these kind of new technologies like waste to energy that Justin was talking about. There are these ways of pulverizing the organics, the food, and turning it into liquid and then pouring it down the drain, which is like the most ridiculous thing, that you'd be sending nutrients down the drain to then be dealt with by wastewater treatment plants. So, but it was high tech, and a lot of people who genuinely wanted to do the right thing, saw kind of the flashy advertising and, the plug and play kind of system. And they're like, we're doing this. I was like, don't do this, please. So anyway, other, like, the statistics that were really getting us, U.S., the biggest export is garbage, and this is the recycling, and to China in particular, which has kind of taken a downturn, as Justin was talking about. But at least when we were doing this a few years ago, we came up with a number of $1 million a day it costs to cart waste out of the city. And then if you think of that waste as being 1/3 at the least of food, right? How much money then is reduced and saved if you're composting that, right? If you're not sending 1/3 or up to a half of that. And this is what I've seen at community compost sites. People come in and they're so jubilant, I can't believe how small my trash bag is now.
Oh, totally.
Right? So
Too, yeah.
that's the first catch, and the second one is when they see their waste turned into this beautiful chocolate, gorgeous soil. They're like, oh, it's magic. I was like, yes, it's magic. Let's keep it going. So, this question, if 1/3 the food is waste, how much savings from, money, this is emissions, this is congestion, would we create if we set up community composting microsites to recycle food and produce new soil? And these sites can be set up, and I've done this, and I'll talk about it in a second, for pretty cheaply with volunteer labor. So we're not talking about big investment either, or you could. If you want to do these like the anaerobic digester kind of route. So Excedentes became Excess NYC. We built this like silly looking bodega quad cycle where the front is where we're collecting edible food to recirculate. That was food rescue, and the back is a tumbler that you can actually spin. You can sit back there and pedal it and spin it as we take it to a compost site. And so we're both doing the edible and the inedible waste food collection, scrap collection. And we were looking at lots to create a compost site with 596 acres, which some of you might be familiar with, doing workshops, building out and redesigning composters, and also looking at like the quality of soil. So this is, in the end, what Excess NYC looks like when it hits the street. Total spectacle, kind of ridiculous, makes people stop, ask a lot of questions, and that for me is a big part of it. And so in our neighborhood in Crown Heights, we had access to this like guerrilla compost site, or we built one out, and collected scraps from the neighborhood, got a bunch of volunteers in our neighborhood, and we composted a ton of waste in a couple of months. And just to say, like, this is possible, right? And this can be fun and engage as many people locally as possible. So that's the little sliver. My friend lives to the left in that building. That is the S train. There's this little sliver of land that's municipal, and he was gardening on there, which I never did a soil test, which really gives me the heebies, but he allowed us to come in and guerrilla garden with him, and we built out our compost site there. And that was the website at the time, and a ton of food waste diverted from landfill. We also went around kind of the New York City tri-state area. I think this was at Stanford, and did events like on their art walk day, and went around to local restaurants. They were told in advance to put food aside, and we did this. Their food waste, which was totally gorgeous. So it made me like, this is what we picked up, and then had picnics as part of our walk. So then, leading from that project, I really got interested in creating a more permanent community compost site, one that we wouldn't just like be kicked out on a moment's notice. And so with a collaborator, Stephanie Barden, we answered a CFP under Bloomberg with his obesity task force, where they listed like a ton of different empty lots that they said would write a proposal to create a garden in one of these lots. And we were given keys to this corner in South Williamsburg. There was no lot on the list that was in either my neighborhood or Stephanie's neighborhood. I can't remember where she was living at the time. But Stephanie's studio was nearby, and I used to live in Williamsburg. So we were really excited to be there. It's also a very visible Bedford Division. It's a very visible corner. And there were already people organizing in the neighborhood for this lot, and they were not able to get keys, so we were able to team up with them, and we became 2 people initiating this into 6 leaders really quickly. And out of those 6, 3 of us are still involved, and this is 4 years later. So anyway, that's what it looked like on day 1 when we got the keys, and that was last summer after hauling in 20 dump trucks of soil from sanitation, from Fresh Kills, from the construction site of Brooklyn Bridge Park. I happen to know one of the landscaper who's designing the park out, and he was like, great, instead of taking our truck out of the city and dumping this in the landfill, we'll just take it over to your corner. And do you have a picture? Yeah. So we put on yellow vests and we tore down the fence, and he sent the trucks over to us, and I don't know how this happened, but it happened. And the reason we needed this is because the lot was really, it was not, graded, and there's a huge dip in it, so we wanted to grade it. And also we did lead tests, and like any, New York City soil, it's very high in lead. And we capped it with 6 inches to a foot, all over 5,000 square feet. So this was a years of work, and everyone in the neighborhood who were observing were very angry about the cardboard. They thought it looked really ugly, and this had been a derelict lot for 40 years, dumping, the stuff that we found in here, cars, there are all kinds of stuff in this lot. But the cardboard, which was exposed for a couple of days in advance of which we used to cap the, another layer, was not, people did not take that very well. And also we weren't growing food right away. So the question was like, okay, your garden, where's the food? And so there was a big conversation about, okay, well, we're actually going to grow soil for several years, and then we're going to grow food. And when we grow food, that's when the interest from boosted in terms of a lot more people wanting to get involved, because this kind of work is not very attractive to many people. It's very attractive to some people, I have to say, but not to most. Anyway, and this is a big pile from Fresh Kills. We found it to be very great quality. We've done testing on it. There's kind of, it depends when you get your shipment from sanitation, and people preference about where the compost is coming from different sites is different qualities. But we've had a very good experience with sanitation. And then we did a lot of group research and development, and thinking about ways to make composting as easy and fast as possible. And so what we did, we had these meetings where we talked about, we researched various systems from industrial to DIY composters, to, kind of more commercial grade, in the middle, and designed our own system, which was based on community sites with the 3 bins, made it a little bit bigger, and then made it into an ASP, or an aerated static pile, which is blasting air into the bays. And that's what the PVC pipes are for. And that's kind of like a bouncy house air blower that is turned on. There's a timer every 30 minutes for 30 seconds. It's solar powered, and it means that you can put the scraps into the composter, and you don't have to turn the piles. So it really reduces the labor. The labor comes at the end when you have to then shovel it and sift it, screen it, and those are pretty big bays. So it generates, I can't remember exactly the amount, but it's a fair amount of soil every 6 weeks during the warmer months. And there's an inside look. You can see we use wood chips, not leaves, because it creates air pockets and it can circulate. And then we're creating all of our own soil for our beds. And members take the soil home for potting their plants, and that was a couple years ago. And then like BK Rot, we have a community, this is Santiago, one of the original founders, and he's on the steering committee with me, leadership, and he and some other people are taking, we don't do bikes, but take the cart around and pick up compost from a couple of residents and also small businesses, cafes, and we charge $20 a month per bucket. And so like there's this one cafe that has 3 buckets a month, so we're getting $60, which is great for funding this volunteer garden, which otherwise doesn't have much revenue stream for materials and stuff. And then I was really interested in the quality of the compost we were making, so not only testing it for levels of lead, but looking at the microbiology and what the makeup of the microbial communities were, and learning a little bit about that. This is a bacteria-feeding nematode eating some plant cellulose. And so really getting interested in how can we visualize the life in the soil and the vitality of the soil. And for me, the microscope really is that way. There's an amoeba. And so talking about, we're growing soil and there's more life in a handful of soil than there is, human on the globe, right? So what does that mean? And what is this life and what is it doing exactly? So that's been part of our conversation. We're called La Casita Verde. We built the La Casita, which is in the background on the upper left corner, and that's like an indoor-outdoor space for meetings and workshops and planning and all kinds of things. And this is kind of fun. The bottom right, this man came by a couple summers ago, and the lot used to have an apartment building which burnt down, and he grew up in that building, and he now lives in New Jersey, and he comes back and is very excited that after 40 years there's something going on that's positive and pretty, and he's a great artist and has helped out with some murals that we made. There are a lot of artists who are involved, and a lot of this is what we do is campaigns to kind of communicate things. This is Marina Zerko, who worked with us to create these pro-composting posters, which we hung on the fence our first season, and to kind of publicize better what we were doing and why. And there's one of the posters. And this is more recent. There's one of the murals that we did this past summer, yeah, in a greenhouse that we built. Okay, so I just also wanted to talk about a current project. This is from really 2018. It started in 2017. And one thing I was really interested in is the testing that was happening at community gardens and in growing spaces is all about lead and the toxins, which are, of course, it's extremely important knowledge. But I was interested in thinking about what other testing and data collection can we do in these spaces to represent the positive ecosystem services that land stewards are providing. And one aspect, and I kept reading about, maybe you all have read this, it's become part of media conversation, was this topic of carbon sequestration in soil. And the idea, and this is a lot of the attention has been on, and a lot of the action has been out west, and on cattle ranches where there are big, swaths of land and prairie grasses. But the idea here is how to use or to kind of help encourage nature's system of bringing carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, so the carbon dioxide being breathed in by the plants, and with light is transformed into liquid carbon or sugars, which is plant food, right? So plants make their own food but some of that liquid carbon goes through plant roots, which I didn't know before all of this, and feeds microbes. And there's this amazing symbiotic relationship between the microbes and the plants. And if you can bring in more of the carbon through photosynthesis and bury it, then is allowed to respirate out. So the carbon can also, through decomposition and breathing, come out of the soil and mix with oxygen again, become CO2, right? So if you can create a system where you're having more inputs than outputs, there are capabilities of reducing carbon dioxide in the air. You can actually see over a year, you can see the earth breathing. So in warmer months, you can see CO2 levels decrease because of photosynthesis, and you can see them increase again as leaves die off and trees are bare. So there are all kinds of ways of applying compost and using cover crops and rotating crops and bolstering the microbial community to tie up that carbon and basically fossilize and become protected in the soil and buried deep where it can stay for many, many years. So I was thinking that we could do this in the city. Like, why are only our rural areas doing this? And city soil, urban soil is very different, right? It's often many types. It's technosols, which means it's human engineered. But what would it look like, and how could you also record that process going on? So I got really excited by all of this. This is a New York Times article, Can Dirt Save the Earth? No, soil can't save the earth, but it can be part of the solution. And this article is actually really great. It's from April of this year, if you're interested in learning more. So the same landscaper who brought the soil to help the foundation grow La Casita Verde, he's a big kind of compostee person and regenerative agriculture person. And he was giving a talk, and there was a microbiologist in the audience. And he was saying it wouldn't be great to go out into the field and be able to get a quick look, like without a microscope, just a quick test to see what the biomass of the microbes are. And she was like, I can do that. She had all these patents for in the pharmaceutical industry, and she figured out she could retool some of the tests she'd already done on human blood, and that could be used to look at the biomass levels. And so there's this test, and when James Sotillo showed me this, I was like, well, this is the way into looking at carbon sequestration. Because if you look at biomass in the soil and you're able to increase it and sustain it, that becomes a proxy for this much longer term carbon sequestration process. The question is, how good is this test? And they've done their own kind of comparisons to lab techniques like carbon fumigation and found it to be very reliable. And then oops, I've done that again. Looking at plant root depth and spread is also another way of indication of carbon sequestration. These are different cover crops I was testing on my balcony. And so as part of, this is the backyard, that's the Billie Jean King Stadium in the distance. But this is the backyard of the New York Hall of Science, and I proposed creating a pilot to look at the ability to carbon sequester in urban soils as part of their designer in residency program, and that happened over 2018. So there are 24 beds. This is the lower site, which I guess there are 12. I'm just gonna move forward. Okay, so this is, and they're basically different planting combinations in these beds. In science, you need to replicate, right? So there are 3 beds. that are planted exactly the same way, and the difference, I have cover crops growing, I have edibles growing, I have sunflowers growing, and then I have a combination of all of those different things, and then I have a set of 3 bare as a control. And I designed this with a team of scientists at Brooklyn College Urban Soils Institute who are partnering on this, who are also at CUNY Graduate Center's Advanced Scientific Research Center, where we're doing all the lab testing. So the idea here is over the course of the year, and now it's extended another year and probably be extended a 3rd year, but over the course of this time, we're looking at many different variables like biomass to see which, all the soil is the same, but which planting varieties and which ways of cultivating the soil produce the highest biomass and sustained biomass over time. And our first round of tests are coming back soon. I'm just going to flip back a little bit because this is actually where it's very interesting about the waste. We have some kits that we put in the bed that are doing remote sensing of like temperature and soil moisture, which again are really good parameters to look at in terms of where we want to be in terms of that sweet spot for carbon sequestration. That's the kit. So the medium itself, we teamed up with the Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation, and they've created this new program called the Pure Soil Bank. And they say it's the first of the kind. And what they're doing is they find construction sites across the city. And these construction sites, this is Jamaica, Queens, and they're building a hotel here. So when they excavate for the foundation, typically they're sending the soil outside of the city to a landfill, and they're paying huge tipping fees, and it's, a gross amount of money and emissions and diesel fuel and all of that kind of stuff. So the city, the Office of Environmental Remediation, they're like, what? There are so many parks and gardens in need of soil and clean soil. This is from 50 feet under the ground, and it's glacial soil created like 20,000 years ago. It's actually not soil, it's sediment. It's basically 100% sand, and it's not so easy to grow in sand. But what they did is they brought from the site 2 dump trucks of the sediment, and then we mixed it, a ratio of 2 to 1, with New York City made compost. So I love to say this is all made in New York City. On the left, it's a year old. On the right, it's 20,000 years old. And that's our grow medium. And we had hugely, that's very early in the season. I don't have any photos to show later in the season. Those are some drone footage. But we planted sorghum grass as part of our cover mix, and it was 8 feet tall. It looks like corn. It was amazing. And the thing that, when I set out to do this, I knew I couldn't do it alone, but I didn't know who would be interested. And I didn't know not only who would be interested, but who would want to spend the time and the resources to develop this platform with me. But at the end of the year, we have a partnership with Brooklyn College Urban Soils Institute, CUNY's Advanced Scientific Research Center. We have another plot of carbon sponge test beds at a NYCHA site at Ravenswood, Queens. The New York City Compost Project, Big Root Reuse, donated soil, as did compost, as did sanitation. Obviously, the help of New York City Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation for the sediment. NYSCI, the New York Hall of Science, has funded and given us land for this for now 2 years, maybe 3 years. Patagonia has given funding. And the other exciting thing is when my collaborators at Brooklyn College and the grad center have been in the labs and are talking to their colleagues, there's now a research scientist in Italy. We're sending our soil to him because he's equipment to look at carbon content in a whole different kind of way. Barath, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, who got his PhD in the same program and is now part of a startup looking at DNA testing of microbiome in the gut, human gut, as well as the soil, which is fascinating because not many people are making the connection between the two, and his company is doing testing so we can look at the DNA and know specifically beyond the microscope next level microscope to know specifically what bacterial and fungal communities are in the soil and what their functions are related to the other tests. So the end goal here, and I'll end with this, is not only for my collaborators to publish white papers in terms of this discussion and looking at and the results from carbon sequestration in urban soils, but while they're doing that work and we're collecting the data, I'm also collecting data with a microbiometer. I'm using a refractometer, which is like $100, looking at pH levels and very easy DIY methods, soil temperature and moisture, so that there can be some sort of kit and protocol for urban gardeners to use to get some sort of a readback and indication of where they are in the spectrum too, and kind of planting recommendations and cultivating recommendations. So it's a very big, ambitious platform that really is in its nascent stages at this point.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we have some time for questions and general discussion.